Good morning. Thank you for being here. We call this meeting to order. You know, owning your own business and being your own boss is part of an American dream. Many Americans pursue that dream by using the proven business models like subcontracting and franchising, which is a result in the successful businesses that provide jobs for millions of Americans. However, the National Labor Relations Board, the Department of Labor, are threatening those business models by changing their joint employer standards. Being deemed a joint employer has huge ramifications. If two businesses are determined to be joint employers, one could be held liable for the other's compliance with the federal labor laws. Last year, the NLRB issued a decision that changed its 30-year-old joint employer standard. Under the new standard, two companies could be classified as a joint employer based on the mere potential to control the terms of the conditions of employment. In January, the Department of Labor issued a joint employer guidance. The DOL effectively abandons the existing Fair Labor Standards Act regulations by declaring that it will apply economic realities tests to determine if there is a joint employer relationship. These ambiguous standards injecting more uncertainty into a variety of business relationships because of increased liability. Larger companies may try to reduce the risk by asserting more control over small businesses that they contract with or ending business relationships. Business models that have provided entrepreneurs with the opportunity to live the American dream may no longer be viable. I believe these misguided changes are a threat to small businesses and need to be reconsidered before significant damage is done to this vital sector in the American economy. I appreciate all the witnesses being here today. I look forward to your testimony, and I yield to the Ranking Member Adams for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Prior to 1935, workers had few rights to freely engage in activities to improve working conditions or pay. As a result, less than 10% of the population was unionized. With enactment of the National Labor Relations Act and creation of the National Labor Relations Board that year, workers' rights were greatly improved. Union membership tripled by the 1950s. Today, however, participation has slipped to nearly pre-NLRA levels, just 12% of the workforce. This drop in worker organization has coincided with a desire by businesses to distance themselves from their workforce through the use of contractors and temporary staffing agencies. Currently, over 3.4 million workers are temporary status, while millions more work for contractors. This business-to-business arrangement primarily benefits the parent company. They can shift the burden of dealing with payroll, benefits, and most importantly, compliance with the NLRA to the contractor. This sharp increase in non-traditional employment has coincided with a change in the joint employer standard in the early 1980s. At that time, the Republican-led NLRB articulated a new, stricter definition of what constitutes a joint employer, where the parent company had to have direct control over operations, hours, or working conditions to be liable for violations of the NLRA. After the ruling, the use of temps and contractors grew and workers' rights suffered. In an effort to better protect vulnerable workers, the NLRB recently changed course on how to determine when multiple companies are joint employers. The new test announced in Browning-Ferris no longer requires that both employers actually exercise the authority to control terms and conditions of employment. Instead of both are employers within the meaning of the common law and share in determining the essential terms and conditions of employment, they will be deemed joint employers. The reaction to the ruling has been mixed. Labor rights experts have lauded the decision as a return to the original intent of the law. They also contend the shared responsibility under the recent decision should result in better oversight and compliance with important labor laws. The impact on workers is particularly important, and I'm eager to hear from today's witnesses on this issue. Critics, on the other hand, claim the change will negatively impact the small business community. However, bringing the larger corporation to the bargaining table could provide small businesses with support and resources that they would otherwise not have in labor disputes before a BFI decision. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today regarding this concern. And one thing that both sides seem to agree on is that it will have an impact on unionizing. With the NLRB indicating the previous standard was too restrictive, allowing companies to skirt labor laws and collective bargaining rights, unions are likely to be embroiled to bring more joint employers to the bargaining table. So I think we can all agree that it's important for businesses to follow applicable labor laws. So I hope we can use today's hearing to explore how the BFI case and subsequent developments at the Department of Labor will impact both workers and businesses. And I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, and I thank you for your participation today. I yield back, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you. Okay, if the committee members have any opening statements prepared, I ask that they be submitted for the record. I'd like to just kind of explain how things work around here. You have a light in front of you. You have each have 5 minutes to deliver your testimony. That light will turn green when you start, and then with 1 minute remaining, the light will turn yellow, and finally at your end, it'll turn red at the last after the 5 minutes. Try to ask you to adhere to those rules the best you can. Now, I'd like to do some introductions for our witnesses. First, we have Mr. Vinay Patel, President and CEO of Fairbrook Hotels in Chantilly, Virginia. He has received several hospitality industry awards, including the Presidential Award by Carlson Companies for the Country Inn and Suites for achieving the highest level of operation of excellence. Mr. Patel holds a Bachelor of Science in Marketing and Business Administration from Virginia Commonwealth University and is testifying on the behalf of the Asian American Hotel Owners Association. Thank you, Mr. Patel, for being here. Up next, we have Mr. Danny Farrar, CEO of Soldier Fit, a fitness company that he co-founded in 2013. Mr. Farrar is an Army veteran who served in Iraq. Soldier Fit, which is based in Frederick, Maryland, is about to open its 4th location and recently awarded 2 franchises. In addition, the Soldier Fit was just named as the Eastern Region's finalist for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce annual Dream Big Small Business of the Year Award. He is testifying on behalf of the Coalition to Save Local Businesses. Mr. Farrar, thank you for your service and thank you for being here. We appreciate everything you do here today. With that, I yield to Ranking Member Adams for her introduction to the next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Harris Freeman is a professor of legal research and writing at Western New England University School of Law and a visiting professor at the Labor Relations and Research Center at the University of Massachusetts. He's taught labor and employment law since 1999, and in 2009, Governor Patrick appointed Professor Freeman to the Commonwealth Employment Relations Board, the appellate agency body that oversees public sector labor relations in Massachusetts. He served on that body until 2016. Professor of Freeman's writings on labor and employment law have appeared in numerous law reviews and labor studies journals, including the Employee Rights and Employment Policy Journal and Working USA, a journal of labor and society. Mr. Freeman, we welcome you today.
Thank you. And our final witness is Mr. Kurt Larkin, a partner in Hutton and Williams in Richmond, Virginia. There he helps businesses of all sizes solve labor and employment challenges. Mr. Larkin previously served in the United States Army, Judge Advocate General Corps, and receives the Meritorious Service Medal of the Armed Commendation Medal and the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal. He has received a law degree from the Temple University and is a bachelor's degree from Dickinson College. Mr. Larkin, thank you for your service and thank you for being here today. With that, Mr. Patel, we'll start with you, and we have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Hardy, Ranking Member Adams, members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today and to share with you my experiences as a small business owner. I look forward to a constructive discussion about how the new joint employer standard will negatively impact my business. My name is Vinay Patel. I'm a first-generation American and proud small business owner from Herndon, Virginia. I'm appearing today not only as a hotelier, but also as a volunteer board member of the Asian American Hotel Owners Association, AHOA. AHOA represents more than 15,000 small business owners who own nearly 50% of all hotels in the United States. My story is just like that of thousands of first and second generation American entrepreneurs. I was born in Malawi, Africa, to parents of Indian origin. My family moved to the United States in 1980 and bought a small 27-room motel. We lived at this motel and did everything, from cleaning rooms to maintenance, and I would pop out of my living room to rent rooms to guests that would come in. This is where I learned the most important lessons in life of hard work, commitment to family, and community service. After graduating from college, we built a second property from the ground up, a 15-room Royal Inn motel, where my wife Tina and I ran the motel and did every aspect of the business. After running the motel for 2 years, I decided it was time to take a risk and grow the company. So I began to look for opportunities in the franchise hotels. While my ambitions were high, so too were the hurdles. Brand after brand turned me down due to lack of experience in franchise properties. After struggling to find a brand partner, Carlson Hotels took a chance on me, and I was able to open up the first Country Inn & Suites in Virginia in 1995, creating 15 new jobs. Today, I have 11 hotels between Maryland and Virginia, and work with major brands including Carlson, Hilton, IHG, Wyndham, Choice Hotels, and proud to employ over 150 associates. I've explained my history in the hotel industry to show you how difficult it is to succeed as a small businessman. For this reason, the new joint employer standard is very concerning. Having faced challenges of two unbranded properties to start my career, franchising provided me the best business model to expand my operations and create hundreds of jobs. As a franchisee, I pay a license and royalty fee. In return, I display a nationally recognized sign at my property and benefit from a wide-reaching marketing campaign and a frontline reservation system. Most importantly, I own and operate my own small business. I take all of the financial risks. I make all of the day-to-day decisions at the hotels. The franchise business model is the best vehicle for small business ownership in the lodging industry. Changes in this model would discourage entrepreneurship and create uncertainty between employers and employees. The standard of the employer liability that exists for more than 30 years was simple, clear, and concisely defined, and consistently defined the relationship between employees and me. Under the new standard, franchisors may be subject to liability based on actions of franchisees. As a result, they will likely choose to work with larger franchisees and forego small business owners like myself. They would have no choice but to exert control over the daily operations of my business. I would cease to be an independent small business owner and would be subject to the directives of a large corporation. Ultimately, I'd become a de facto employee of a corporate brand. Most threatening to my business is the Department of Labor's characterization of employer labor. The administrator's interpretation directly takes aim at the hospitality industry. It suggests that I jointly employ my staff with the franchisor, simply because they're wearing shirts bearing the name of the national brand. As I mentioned before, the license agreement allows me to use the logo for marketing. Ultimately, I employ my team. I sign their paychecks, regardless of what logo is on their shirt. In my experience, there's no circumstance in which the national brands dictate the tasks of my employees. Frankly, if these burdensome circumstances existed when I entered the business, I would not have chosen the entrepreneurship path. The new rule threatens my ability to own and operate my business, to create and maintain good jobs and the stability of a franchise model. Chairman Hardy, Ranking Member Adams, and the distinguished members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I urge this committee to pass legislation that will reestablish the traditional joint employer standard that has allowed my family to realize the American dream of small business ownership. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Farrar?
Good morning, Chairman Hardy, Ranking Member Adams, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Danny Farrar, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Soldier Fit. I am humbled by your invitation to speak on behalf of hundreds of small business owners like myself who are members of the Coalition to Save Local Business. Mr. Chairman, I am an 8-year military veteran who served in the United States Army, including a combat tour in Iraq, a former firefighter and EMT, and a certified personal trainer with over a decade of experience. Today, I am a small business owner and entrepreneur. We operate 3 gyms in Maryland and will soon open our 4th. I am also a franchisor, and we recently awarded our first 2 franchises to further grow our concept. So while some people hear the term franchise or franchisor and think only of major corporations, they can also think of me, my small business, and my story, and the story of hundreds of thousands of both franchisors and franchisees who are small business owners. Together with my friend and one-time mentor, Dave Posen, I co-founded Soldier Fit, a fitness company committed to the ideals of community, patriotism, and the pursuit of the American dream. I am also the president and co-founder of Platoon 22, a nonprofit started to combat the depression and dislocation that leads to 22 veterans a day who take their own lives. We are helping brave servicemen and women who have charged into combat on behalf of our nation, only to return scarred physically, mentally, or both, just as I once was. So as you can see, I've held many positions throughout my life, and the threat of unlimited, unpredictable joint employer liability is very scary. It threatens everything my partners and colleagues have worked for in order to build our community. While today I appear before you as a small business leader, my road here was long and challenging. Mr. Chairman, I was adopted at age 2. I graduated from high school 146 out of 147. I left for boot camp after graduation, and on September 11, 2001, I took the first team for the Army into the Pentagon to aid in search and rescue for survivors and remains. In the days that followed, I took jobs here and there, but I soon ended up homeless. I once again turned to the military and was deployed to Iraq, where I completed over 700 convoy missions. I've been blown up and shot at just about any place you can get blown up and shot at. When I returned home, I hit rock bottom. I drank, I self-medicated, and ultimately decided that my life was not worth living and attempted suicide. Somehow I got a second chance. Today I lead a company that has been the recipient of several small business awards from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in the state of Maryland, as well as I was featured on the cover of Men's Health magazine. I've gone from the kid who barely graduated high school to giving the commencement address at one. But Mr. Chairman, the National Labor Relations Board threatens everything that I and millions of small business owners have built. When the NLRB decided to change the joint employer liability standard in August of 2015, it was a scary moment for local business owners like myself. For decades, the joint employer standard had protected businesses like mine from the liability of employees over which we have no actual or direct control. That has always made sense. But now in adopting this new, ambiguous, indirect, and even reserved control standard, the NLRB has made employers potentially liable for employees they do not employ. That is nonsense. Mr. Chairman, from the perspective of small business, it appears that Washington regulators are attempting to facilitate a corporate takeover of Main Street. If regulators make large primary companies liable for the employment actions of third-party vendors, suppliers, franchisors, or subcontractors over which they have no direct control, large companies may be compelled to exercise more control over these small businesses to limit their new liability. Consequently, local business owners may effectively be demoted from entrepreneur to middle manager, as they are gradually forced to forfeit operational control of their stores, clubs, inns, or restaurants that they built. Thus, the joint employer means big companies will get bigger, and small business may run out of business partners and ultimately fade away. On another note, Mr. Chairman, many local business owners are nervous about the implications of joint employer on their future access to capital. The members of this subcommittee well know that the Small Business Administration Loan Guarantee Program is critical for creation and growth of small business, as it was for Soldier Fit. But as SBA considers to change its loan approval process, it is important for the agency to keep in mind, however, anti-small business federal agencies are changing the definition of joint employer and how they may reduce that access to capital. I urge the subcommittee members to protect small businesses' access to SBA loan guarantees. The bottom line on the joint employer as a threat to small business, Mr. Chairman, is this. No one can assure me that my business, or anyone else's business, may not run afoul of a vague joint employer liability standard based on indirect or even unexercised reserve control. That's why I and so many small business owners around the country need help. We are asking Congress to pass a simple, one-sentence legislation contained in H.R. 3459, the Protecting Local Business Opportunity Act. Mr. Chairman, this country allowed me to achieve the American dream, and I found a small business committed to enabling others to achieving their American dream. Please protect small businesses like mine and give us certainty that federal agencies in Washington are not going to needlessly threaten our business. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership on this issue, and I would be happy to answer any questions you have. God bless.
Thank you, Mr. Farrar. Mr. Freeman?
Good morning. I'd like to thank Chairman of the Subcommittee, Congressman Crescent Hardy, Ranking Member Congresswoman Alma Adams, and the other members of the subcommittee for this opportunity. I have 2 points to make this morning. First, the more inclusive joint employer doctrine adopted by the NLRB and Browning-Ferris was an appropriate response to the rapid expansion of subcontracting and precarious low-wage work. Second, the BFI joint employer standard will do no harm to America's small businesses, even as it provides a potential path to meaningful collective bargaining for a significant sector of the low-wage workforce. I begin my remarks by focusing on the industrial realities of low-wage temping and franchising arrangements because it is believed that BFI will have an impact on employment in these arenas. Temporary staffing and franchising account for a disproportionate share of the economic growth since the Great Recession of 2008. Close to 3 million employees work in temp positions, and another 2.8 million work in just the fast food sector of franchising. And while profits are high in these sectors, poverty-level wages, underemployment, extraordinarily high rates of wage theft pervade the temporary staffing industry and franchised fast food outlets and janitorial services. For example, temp workers comprise 3/4 of the 150,000 workers who load and unload goods at warehouses used by Walmart and other big box stores in Chicago. As temps, they experience a large wage penalty, earning $9 an hour, $3.48 lower than direct hires. 2/3 live below the poverty level. Households that include fast food franchise workers are 4 times as likely to live below the poverty level. As a result, taxpayers shell out $3.8 billion a year to subsidize public benefits for these workers. This type of systemic inequality and poverty also hurts small business owners. Like their employees, many franchise owners, not all but many, are squeezed by big franchisors who impose non-negotiable terms of engagement on franchise owners that tend to push down wages, promote costly churning of the workforce, and significantly create high failure rates for franchise owners. The BFI decision should be understood in this context as a proper exercise of the board's statutory authority, and it is in no way radical. The basic joint employment test has not changed. It remains a case-specific, fact-intensive inquiry to determine whether an employer shares or co-determines the terms and conditions of employment. What the NLRB did do is return to the traditional joint employer test endorsed by the Supreme Court 50 years ago. This closed a loophole created by board rulings in the 1980s. Now, the inquiry is broader. The board no longer is limited to examining whether an employer controls employees directly and immediately. Instead, a traditional multi-factor common law inquiry is used. The BFI case illustrates how this works. In a representation case, the NLRB found that the recycling center maintained legal control over 240 long-term temps by issuing precise directives to hire, to fire, to control the line speed, and other aspects of the work environment. These directives were given directly by BFI and through the supervisors of the temporary staffing agency on site. The terms of the temporary staffing agreement also expressly ceded the right to control the workforce to the recycling center. The board concluded that the recycling center was a joint employer because BFI affected the means and the manner by which employment was directed there. Nothing in this ruling presents a new or heightened level of legal uncertainty for large or small employers that use temps in staffing. The NLRB has made it clear that a potential finding of joint employment arises when the structure of staffing arrangements cedes to the user firm an extensive level of direct or indirect control over the means and manner of work. It is also clear that BFI does not predetermine or rig the outcome of joint employer inquiry in franchising. This was made clear by the General Counsel a year ago in a detailed advice memorandum that applied the BFI case to a franchisor nutritionality. The advice memo concluded that the franchise agreement and directives did exercise control over brand and product quality, but in no way did it exercise any control over the terms and conditions of employees at the franchise outlets. The unfair labor practice case was dismissed without a hearing. A different result may, of course, arise when you have a tightly controlled business format franchisee agreement, but the board has not yet addressed and finalized any kind of inquiry into this type of scenario. But the board has provided significant guidance for franchisors. The General Counsel has said that they should be exempt from a finding of joint employment if they're only controlling work conditions to support brand quality and the brand name. The statement of the General Counsel has recognized that not all franchisors, in fact, most franchisors, will not be joint employers. In conclusion, it is my view that the board's revival of the traditional joint employer standard is an appropriate exercise of the statutory authority granted to it by Congress, particularly when considered in light of the NLRB's obligation to apply labor law to changing economic realities. It is a flexible test for employers and is also positive and allows fair treatment and decent wages for low-wage temp workers. Thank you for considering my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Mr. Larkin, apologize. As you heard the alarms, we've been called to votes on the floor, so we're going to recess for probably reconvene somewhere around 10 till the hour, so apologize for that. We're in recess.
well.
They warned me.
They did. I didn't get the warning. I'm listening to this. I'm like, it's totally distracting.
Oh,
Committed. Calls. No buzzer was gonna stop.
I'm telling you, that's what I had to do, you know? Who
We'll reconvene this meeting. Mr. Larkin, thank you for waiting, and begin with your testimony. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hardy, members of the subcommittee. It is a privilege to be here with you today to talk about an issue of critical importance to American small business. The executive branch's ongoing efforts to expand the legal standards for determining if one business is the joint employer of individuals employed by another business. Now, for over 30 years, the NLRB adhered to a fairly straightforward joint employer standard. The board treated separate companies as joint employers if they shared or co-determined essential terms and conditions of employment. Now, the board would look to whether the putative joint employer exercised meaningful control over hiring, firing, discipline, compensation, supervision, and direction, and whether its control over such matters was direct and immediate. This standard was easy for businesses to understand and, more importantly, to plan for. But that all changed this past summer. In August of 2015, the board departed from this precedent in a case called Browning-Ferris Industries and announced a test of sweeping scope that could redefine the employer-employee relationship across all areas of business. Now, under this new test, the board may find a business to be a joint employer where it has the mere potential to control the employment terms of another business's employees, or where it exercises such control, but only indirectly. This leads to an obvious question. If a putative joint employer never actually exercises direct control over the employees of another company, how much retained or indirect control is sufficient to establish joint employer status? Well, the murky guidance provided in the board's opinion makes this question virtually impossible to answer. Now, some have argued that the Browning-Ferris case dealt with a temporary staffing firm and its client, and that other business models were unaffected by the board's decision. But the potential control and indirect control standards announced in the case are broad enough to cover virtually any business relationship, including general contractor and subcontractor, outsourced service provider and user of outsourced service, parent and subsidiary, and franchisor or franchisee. The NLRB is not the only federal agency that has waded into the joint employer conversation in recent months. This January, the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Administrator issued formal guidance on the joint employer standards under the Fair Labor Standards Act and the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act. The guidance goes into detail on the concept of vertical joint employment, which the DOL defines for the first time as when the employee of one company is economically dependent on another company which retained the services of his or her employer. The FLSA regulations do not address this concept. Instead, it is addressed in the Migrant Act, a statute with a very narrow and specific legislative purpose to combat the abuse of migrant farm labor workers in this country. The DOL's new guidance cleverly imports that standard into the FLSA and encourages investigators to pursue vertical joint employment in wage hour investigations. The DOL appears to have worked on this guidance in secret. They certainly did not solicit the input of the employer community. Those in favor of these actions claim that expanded joint employer liability is a good thing, that it will combat against unscrupulous employers who take advantage of the growing contingent workforce. That approach assumes, incorrectly in my view, that the use of temporary employees is always somehow inappropriate. Regardless, these legal standards make no exception for the scrupulous employer, whatever that might mean. And they sweep with a broad brush across all industries and virtually all types of business relationships, ensnaring arrangements that are perfectly legal and vital to the growth and success of small business in this country. And as for the Freshie board memorandum, board advice memoranda are non-binding, have no effect on how the full board decides a later case, and they do not bind the board's general counsel. And Freshie was issued prior to the Browning-Ferris decision, making it all but obsolete. Ultimately, uncertainty over how to deal with the board's new standard and perhaps the standards of other executive agencies poses a grave risk to small business owners. Larger employers may conclude that they're going to be held responsible for the liabilities of their suppliers, subcontractors, or franchisees. They must exert more control over their day-to-day operations so that they can be more aware of and seek to mitigate these liabilities. Franchisors would become responsible for matters like who to hire, when to fire, how much to pay. Their administrative costs would skyrocket. On the other hand, small business owners would be relegated to middle managers, no longer in control of their ultimate business success. These negative effects could cause both sides to reconsider their business relationships altogether. And you don't need to take my word for it. You've already heard from 2 small business owners this morning who fear those very outcomes. Members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the employer community, I respectfully submit to you that the board's previous joint employer standard worked well for over 30 years. It provided management and labor alike with predictability in terms of who is the employer of any given group of employees, knowledge that is vital to stable bargaining and effective labor relations. The new standard shatters that stability and throws both sides into new and unprecedented territory. Congress should intervene and return the board's standard to the well-understood rule that existed prior to Browning-Ferris. Thank you very much for the privilege of testifying here today.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll begin our line of questioning, and again, thank you for being here. And with that, I'll start. I'd like to address Mr. Larkin first. The critical question when it comes to the NLRB is how much control makes you a joint employer? When will business know the answers to the question? And in the meantime, what advice is given have you been given to your clients?
Well, the critical question, Mr. Chairman, the answer to that is that, and part of the problem is that there is no more bright line standard, so I don't know how to answer that question. And I've had considerable reflection on that, and our clients have had a considerable worry about that. The board's new test provides little to no guidance as to what level of retained control, if it's not exercised, will be sufficient to make you a joint employer. So it's virtually impossible to predict what level of control is insufficient under the test to make you a joint employer.
Thank you. Mr. Larkin, also some folks, including Professor Harris, have pointed to the advice memo that the NLRB issued that stated the Freshie Act, or Freshie, is not liable as a joint employer, as an indicator that the standard is not as broad as the community thinks, and the franchise business should not be concerned. Can you elaborate on why the Freshie memo isn't comforting to the franchise businesses?
Yes, sir. Well, as I addressed in my remarks, Labor Board advice memoranda are non-binding. They do not bind the full National Labor Relations Board, and even in the Freshie case, the General Counsel was free to ignore it if he wanted to, and the full Labor Board would not have had to rely on it. So board memoranda, advice memoranda, do not set board standard. And as I said, the memo was issued prior to the issuance of Browning-Ferris, so the law on which it relies is now obsolete and replaced by Browning-Ferris. So I don't think it provides any comfort to those in the franchising business.
Thank you. Mr. Patel, you in your testimony indicated that if this rule would have existed when you started, that you might have looked at another business opportunity. Do you think the business climate, other than the one you're doing right now, do you think the business climate is discouraging people to start businesses?
If these same rules were applicable 20, 30 years ago, I don't think I'd be in business. I mean, not forget looking for different businesses, but I don't think there's an opportunity to do business in terms of what's out there. And if you look at the story that for the Asian American Hotel Owners Association, is many of the people that came over many years ago, we talk about amongst the community and say, I don't think we could do what we did 20, 30 years ago today. The regulations that we have, the taxes that are implied to us, I don't think you could do what we did 20, 30 years ago in today's environment.
Thank you. So if franchisers today started asserting their control and authority over your business today, how would that affect your daily operations, and how on the other hand, franchisers take away some of that guidance that that benefits you? Could you currently provide some information on how that affects you also?
Running a business today is not easy. I mean, if dealing with customers, dealing with employees, dealing with a lot of other issues that are out there, just running a day-to-day business is not an easy task. Now you throw in the fact that you've got other regulations, not only the governmental regulations, but if a franchisor comes in and says, hey, you've got to do this, the employee has to be this, or whatever regulations or whatever things that they put upon us as from a franchisee perspective, that's one more thing that we have to worry about. And like I said, today's business is not an easy business to operate, and so that's one more thing that we have to worry about, and we would not want to be in that environment.
Thank you. Now turning to Mr. Farrar. Soldier Fit was just awarded 2 franchises given the new joint employer standards, and our decision today, are you having difficult time with the decisions today? Are you having a difficult time with how much or how little guidance to provide your franchisee?
On our end, sir, it's scary. I mean, you don't know. Like I said, the law is very ambiguous. Where am I going to overstep that bounds? But at the same time, when that franchisee is coming to us, what are they really purchasing? They're purchasing our mistakes, if you want to be honest on it, because we're going to help them navigate past the things that we made mistakes on to get to where we are presently much, much faster. But if I'm sitting there worried about how much advice or how much training and when and where our company can help with them, then that does give us a moment to pause.
Thank you. With that being said, with all the challenges that you've gone through, do you think with this decision today, would you have started your operation, your franchise the same way or today?
We probably would not have. I mean, we've invested already at least $300,000 into this. That's not chump change for a small business by no stretch of the imagination. And if we're sitting down here and all of a sudden we're listed as a joint employer, we get 7% on what they do. If we all of a sudden have to up our back office so that we can actually make sure that we have a real finger on the pulse of everything that's happening day to day, that's going to cost us a lot of money, and the return on investment isn't there, so it wouldn't make sense.
Thank you. Thank you for testimony. My time has expired. I'll yield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Freeman, you mentioned that temporary workers experience a wage penalty compared to their permanent counterparts. Can you explain what a wage penalty is and why it occurs?
Certainly. The use of temporary staff, I'm sorry, let me turn the sound on for everyone. The use of temporary staffing agencies in large and small employers today is often set up to charge the user employer a fee per hour for each temp worker who is deployed to the user employer's firm to do the basic work of that firm. But the temp worker receives sometimes as little as 60% of the fee that's paid to the staffing agency. That's a huge profit that's made simply for the process of deploying a person to do work somewhere else. That's the wage penalty. The significance of this today is that in wide swaths of manufacturing, logistics, food processing, all or significant parts of the workforce in many facilities. This goes for Nissan plants in Mississippi. It goes for food processing plants in New Bedford, Massachusetts, near where I live. They are temp workers, and they are there permanently. No one grows up and wants to say, I want to work for a temp agency for the rest of my life. And that's what we are now experiencing. That's the wage penalty. And in those situations, you have the classic potential for joint employment, because it is the user employer who is setting up the facility, deploying the managers, deploying the supervisors, that is providing direction, both directly and indirectly, for the work that's performed by these temp workers. That is what the joint employer standard is set up to address, so you can bring the people to the bargaining table, should workers choose to unionize, and have everybody there who's responsible for the work conditions. If they're not at the bargaining table and you make a demand for an increase in the wage, the temp agency can say, well, I can't give it to you because the wage limit is set by the user employer by contract. And that is exactly what happened in the BFI case. Now, this is a totally different situation than what's facing Mr. Farrar and Mr. Patel. I don't think from what they said that they're joint employers in any way under the board standard. And I don't think that this changes the modus operandi of their business at all.
Thank you. Isn't it the case that common law of agency provides for both direct and indirect control over terms and conditions of employment? And isn't that what was decided by the BFI case?
Yes, the BFI case, as I said earlier, is neither radical or new. It restates the standard that was established in the Boyer versus Greyhound case back in 1965, and is merely a return to a standard that recognizes that the right to control, and whether that right be exercised directly or indirectly, is part of what constitutes the legal standard for control under the common law agency test. There is nothing exceeding that that's in the board standard. And retaining that right to control by contract is a critical aspect of what an employer does when they draw up a contract with for example, a temporary staffing agency. So I see nothing unusual about this, and in situations where you are not in a position to contract to have that kind of control, you're not a joint employer. And the problems that I identified here, the problems of low wages in situations where there might be joint employment, these problems were not created by the joint employment doctrine. These problems are created by larger economic forces that the board is now exercising its authority to try to set up a situation to give workers the opportunity, should they so choose, to engage in meaningful bargaining to affect terms and conditions that are created by more than one business entity that they work for.
Okay. Let me ask you, Congress is now considering H.R. 3459, Protecting Local Business Opportunity Act. It's been reported out of the Education Workforce Committee on a party line vote. The bill would limit a joint employer to only those who have actual direct and immediate control. And it's argued that this bill would protect the independence of franchisees as independent business owners. But isn't it possible that the bill would actually have the perverse effect of weakening the independence of franchisees?
Well, certainly, because what that does, it completely eliminates the possibility of a franchisor ever being a joint employer and taking responsibility for terms and conditions of employment that it is creating through the franchising agreement it has with a franchisee. This is going to free up the franchisor to increase the degree of control it may have over franchisees. And I don't think that's what franchisees would want. So I think this, as you say, may have a rather perverse effect and may do exactly the opposite of what some of the bill's sponsors intend. And I do not think it's a good idea. I think it's much better to have these things adjudicated on a case-by-case, fact-specific basis.
Thank you, sir. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr.
Now turn the time over to Mr. Kelly for questions for 5 minutes.
Thank the witnesses for being here, and Mr. Farrar and Mr. Larkin, thank you for your service to our country. I generally joke with my JAG officers, though I don't know if I count that or not, being a lawyer myself, Mr. Larkin, but thank you for your service.
I've heard that before.
Small businesses are so critical to this nation, and that's why I love being on this committee. Mr. Farrar and Mr. Patel, I pay attention to you because you've owned small businesses. And unless you've owned a small business, you can't, from the academia world, understand what goes on in a small business. But I would venture to say that in your first couple of years in small business, can either of you comment to whether or not you worked at below or at no minimum wage as a owner of a franchise, either a franchise or a franchisee? Can you comment on your earning as the actual owner of that franchise or franchisee?
During my first couple of years, me and my wife were on the property 24 hours. So if you divide up the hours and the amount of salary we took in or the profits we took in from the business, we were negative below minimum wage. So again, I think many small business owners face the same issue in terms of, as far as minimum wage, do we really earn? Especially with the fact that we put a lot of hours behind that business, whether it be 24, whatever hours we put out there, but it's definitely below what we have there.
I was homeless, so yes, sir. And at the end of the day, you know, if you own a business, that's your passion. I mean, you don't just say, hey, I'm going to start this in 5 o'clock, it's over. You know, owning a small business takes a toll not only on yourself, on your family as well. So I'm working 24 hours a day.
And they like to talk about the temporary workforce. But can you guys, Mr. Patel and Mr. Farrar, and I kind of want a short answer to this, but can you tell me what your most important investment in your company being successful is?
For us, is human capital.
People, right?
People. I mean, again, for just a really quick, simple analogy on this is that today in the hotel business is becoming a commodity. You can go to the Holiday Inn, you can go to the Hampton Inn, a room is a room, the breakfast is a breakfast. The only way we differentiate our properties to the competition is through our people. And so we need the ability to manage our own employees at our own hotels. That's the only way we can get a competitive advantage compared to the next hotel over.
Mr. Farrar?
We have a saying in Soldier Fit, whose company? It's our company. It's everybody's company. I don't even make the most of my company. So the truth of the matter is, if you start a business, you're doing it for passion, you're going to take care of the people that help your dream along.
And it goes back to my thing. Those people, you make sure that they're invested in your company. You're going to pay them as well as you can. Sometimes there's sacrifices, but it comes down to if they're not committed, temps don't give you that same commitment, do they?
Negative.
Okay. And as a franchisee, Mr. Patel, do you prefer hiring temps, or do you prefer hiring people who have an investment in your company who want to see it grow and want to grow with you?
We hire our own people. We actually purchased a hotel a couple of years ago in Baltimore, and the previous owner had temp people there. After we took it over, we just did our own employees. It's just better to manage our own people.
And on our end, sir, we have over 60 employees. We've hired outside of our company 9 times. Now, out of our personal trainers, only 2 are outside the company. 98% of our trainers started off as members in our company, then got their certifications, and then became trainers.
And finally, I think there was a comment of, I don't think that it would apply to you as a franchisee or a franchisor, but I don't think. Can you tell me, if we do this on a case-by-case basis, how much money you're going to pay to people like Mr. Larkin over there to represent you, and does that make prices go up for the consumer and also make your wages lower because you have less money to pay the employees that you currently hire because you're defending lawsuits one by one?
Most small business like us, we don't have in-house attorneys. We don't have people to do that sort of stuff for us. We're busy running our operations. So for us, to hire somebody outside would be a killer.
And NLRB, I'm sure if you make the wrong decision based on what you think is right, and that you had good intentions and you intended to do right, I'm sure they don't fine you if you had good intentions and you made a mistake that was honest and truthful that they didn't know the answer. They don't fine you, do they?
They fine.
Absolutely, they fine you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Now turn the time over to Ms. Velasquez, the ranking member on the Small Business Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Freeman, we have heard that the BFI decision is going to significantly impair the franchisor-franchisee business model. What do you have to say about the argument that the BFI joint employer test will impair this business model?
Well, the core of my response to that would present a different frame on what the NLRB has said about franchising than is presented by Mr. Larkin.
Mm-hmm.
The NLRB has twice made statements in the General Counsel's amicus brief in the BFI case and in the advice memo in nutritionality that has very clearly indicated that franchisors are there to protect their brand and to protect the product quality. And when they are exercising direct control over aspects of a franchisee enterprise to that end, that the board is not going to pursue any kind of joint employer doctrine to hold the franchisor responsible at all. Mm. Now, it is true that these are advice memos, but the General Counsel is the person who ultimately chooses to prosecute. In nutritionality, the case was dismissed and it never had to go to the board. Now, there may be some cases, certainly not the kind of case that I hear from Mr. Patel and Mr. Farrar, mm-hmm. where new levels of technology have created the ability of franchisors to exercise tremendous amounts of control in a franchise enterprise. Now, the board has a responsibility when you have new technologies, changes in the actual industrial landscape of our nation, to take a look at this and engage in a fact-specific inquiry to see whether there might be a problem. That's going on in the McDonald's case right now, and we will see what happens. But that certainly seems to be a far cry Correct. From the situation of many other franchisors. So I am not concerned about overreach here. We have plenty of contractors and subcontractors that have been unionized, that engage in all kinds of business processes that have never been subject to joint employment over the history of the board's operation.
Thank you. And I think there is universal agreement that union organizing is likely to increase following the BFI decision. How is that going to impact small business contractors and franchisors?
Well, we have many small business individuals that are subcontractors and contractors who have unionized workforces. In fact, if you look in the construction industry, we've established a very vital middle class for construction workers through the unionization of major sections of commercial construction. I think it's been a benefit to our nation. It's been a benefit to the contractors who have greater workforce stability and a much stronger workforce. I think that kind of stability would be a positive thing in a place like the fast food franchises, where right now you have workers attempting to make a living in a situation that's netting them poverty-level wages and placing a burden upon the taxpayer. So in those situations, we may see unionization. I also think that we're facing situations in the manufacturing and food processing center where you have a lot of temping, where we could radically improve the situation of the workforce and make the business more stable, increase the buying power of the workforce to increase business overall in the United States. And I think that the BFI standard makes that more possible than was the case under the old standard that the board reversed.
Thank you. Mr. Farrar, I understand your concern about protecting your brand in the franchise agreement, but if a franchisor prescribes rules that could violate the NLRA at the franchisee's level, should the parent company be held accountable?
If I understand your question correctly, you're asking me, should we be able to impose these rules and regulations? But again, it goes back to, we don't know what the rules and regulations are. It hasn't been spelled out clearly. We don't know. So you could very easily say that, come up with something and say that we were the ones that we overstepped our bounds. And that's what's scary about it. That's why we don't know how best to help the franchisee. That literally, that's why they purchased the franchise, is because they wanted some mentorship. We don't know when it's going to be considered that we overstepped our bounds and now we're directly doing anything with them. So it's frightening.
Mr. Freeman, would you mind to care about his assertion?
I think that we now have some very clear guidance, given the statement in the advice memo and given the General Counsel's statements about franchising, that make it clear what level of control would have to be exercised by a franchisor before there would be even an investigation of joint employment that could go to a hearing. We now have cases that have been dismissed without hearing, that is, without the kind of expense of that extensive litigation. So I don't see this as a real problem. I think that when you do have a situation of extensive joint employer control, all employers in America should be held liable to labor standards as they are to all other legal standards. And I would finally say that as someone who has been involved in adjudicating labor disputes for a long time, we have many aspects of labor law that are situations that involve the application of complex standards to any given fact situation.
Quick as you can, your time's expired.
Thank you.
This is nothing new.
I yield back. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. Just one comment that I'd like to make is, I've spent 40 years in the construction industry. Know it very well, understand it very well, watched many studies over the years. So with statements like that are made, sometimes frustrate a guy like me, because the studies are out there that showed that these union operators, construction workers, have not necessarily benefited the taxpayer. Yes, it's benefited their pockets and the administrations of unions over the years. That's why union have continued to decline. It's actually proven that, like school projects in Ohio, they actually showed that they had 12 to 15% savings when it was gone out to competitive bid versus a union mandate type projects. In Nevada, we've had studies that show that of the $4.7 billion spent on schools, that we could have probably done another 25 to 35% more schools if it hadn't have gone under the prevailing wage workforce. So is that a savings to the taxpayer? With that, I'd like to give everybody just 2 more minutes to wrap up and make a comment. So I'm going to start with Mr. Larkin first, if you don't mind. We'll come from the other side. Anything that you missed that you might like to bring forward?
Sure. A couple of things, just specifically on this franchise question and the guidance that has come down from the General Counsel and the Freshie memo. The idea that merely protecting your brand and your product quality won't make you a joint employer. Well, who's going to make that decision? The NLRB. And they've told us that they're going to make that decision on a case-by-case basis using a standard that is literally unintelligible. My clients ask me, how much control do I have to exercise before I can be a joint employer? And my honest answer to them today is, I don't know. And I don't like giving that advice. But that's the advice that I'm giving right now. And so the problem with this standard is that its application is in the eye of the beholder. And it is the fact that there's only been one decision, this Browning-Ferris decision, and that the next big joint employer decision may not come for a while, that's not the end of the inquiry. The real problem, as you've heard today, is the potential chilling effect that this may have on the franchise that never opens, on the employees who are never hired, because someone, whether it's a franchisor, a franchisee, a large general contractor who decides to insource a specialty trade rather than outsource it, whatever the case may be, it is that business owner who makes the decision not to go into business with another business because they don't want to be the next guinea pig before the board. That's the problem that I think this standard creates for all of us on the employer side, and that's what we are grappling with.
Thank you. Mr. Freeman, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hardy. I think today we have a situation in the United States where we have seen tremendous prosperity that has been achieved by franchisors and major corporations. We see small business owners squeezed, and we also see, it may be hard to run a small business today. I certainly appreciate what these gentlemen are saying to my left, but it's also hard to be a worker today in this economy, especially working in low-wage sectors, and franchising is among them, and in areas of manufacturing and food processing and logistics, where temping is widespread, it is hard to be a worker. These workers are not able to make a living wage. When you are working full-time and you are still forced to go to the government to get benefits, we have a social problem of inequality that needs an answer from many different parts of our government and our business community. One of those answers is giving workers voice, giving them an opportunity to exercise their bargaining power in the labor market, to sit down across the table from those individuals who are setting the terms and conditions of employment and engaging in a conversation to explain what they need to make a living and what they need to do their job correctly. In that regard, I think that the success of unions in raising the wages and living standards of their members when unions were large extended well beyond the unionized workforce and created a higher standard of living for all workers, whether they were unionized or not. The shrinkage of union representation, particularly in a low-wage economy, is hurting all workers, and I think it's also hurting the opportunities that small business has to grow and to maintain their workforces. So I have a somewhat different view of the importance of the National Labor Relations Act in improving the situation and the business climate and the living standards of workers in America.
Thank you for being here. Mr. Farrar.
This whole morning we've talked about the benefit to the employees, and the fact of the matter is small businesses, the largest employer in the United States. And when we look at what's happened over the past several years, franchising has outpaced organic startups continuously. So if we're going to move forward and make sure that we still have stability in the economy, I want to move forward on something a little bit stronger than I think. I want to know exactly what is the ruling, what is the law, when do I become a joint employer, and when I am not. I appreciate y'all's time.
Thank you for being here. Mr. Patel.
Thank you for inviting us today. The biggest success factor in our business is people, and we talk about franchisor, franchisee, and all the benefits from franchisors. And so when they say, well, they do this, do that, the franchisor can tell me what kind of soap I can put in my room. It's a tangible item. Put in, certain type of soap. It's a tangible item to put in X kind of sheets. It's a tangible item to put in X kind of donuts or for breakfast item. But when you start dealing with people, it's difficult. You have different people in all different places all over the world, and so dealing with people is very difficult. So when the franchisor comes in and has any kind of impact on me, on my ability to manage the people, and that makes it hard for us. And so I feel like from my last moment would be to say, the people is how we want to manage our hotel. That's what makes us different, and so we just can't have any kind of issues or legislation that impacts my ability to manage my staff members in my hotel.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being here today. I appreciate your attendance and your hearing your words of wisdom. Today's hearing has really highlighted the confusion that I think and challenges that these new joint employer standards are creating for a wide variety of small businesses. We are going to continue our work here with our colleagues and continue this committee to educate the workforce and address these problems. I ask unanimous consent for the members to have 5 days to submit the statements and the supporting materials for the record. Any objection? Without objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned.